watching Eagle News International. On tonight's headlines. President Biden's historic move to ease gas prices, tapping the U.S. strategic oil reserve 1 million barrels a day for 6 months. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is warning that Russia is consolidating and preparing powerful strikes in the country's east and south. Plus, Moscow on Friday accused Kiev of carrying out its first airstrike on Russian soil. Singapore fully reopens its borders to all vaccinated visitors after a 2-year coronavirus closure. And the WHO launches its bid to stop a new global health pandemic.
Research and development.
Russian intentions is still unclear, but judging by their actions, Kiev is still very much in their sights tonight. In fact, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is warning that Russia is consolidating and preparing powerful strikes in the country's east and south, including the besieged Mariupol, where a new attempt will be made today to evacuate civilians from the devastated city. Take a look.
Також на Донбасі, у Маріуполі, на Харківському напрямку російські війська накопичують потенціал для ударів, потужних ударів. Будемо захищатися, будемо робити все, що зможемо ми, щоб зупинити окупантів і очистити нашу землю від їхніх злих і безглуздих химер. Хай в Москві не забувають, що санкційна політика буде тільки продовжуватись і посилюватись. Поки немає миру, потрібні санкції. Поки Росія не почала вкладатися так само щиро у пошук миру, як вона вкладається у знищення нашої держави, санкції залишаться без альтернативи.
Now, Washington echoed that assessment with a senior U.S. defense official saying Russia's focus on Donbass could herald a longer and more prolonged conflict. Take a look.
If, in fact, they're going to prioritize the Donbass region, if what they say they're going to do, they actually do, an area that they have now fought over for 8 years, an area where there are many Ukrainian armed forces who are also very active. This could drag on for a while, but we don't see any indication that they're going to be sent home. The best assessment we have, and it's an assessment at this early stage, is that they're going to be repositioned probably into Belarus to be refit and resupplied and used elsewhere in Ukraine. Again, where is that elsewhere? We don't exactly know.
While President Putin's forces pivot to the east, U.S. military officials say the tempo of Russian air assault has picked up over the last 24 hours. And even so, Ukraine's resistance, backed by millions in Western military aid, has been unexpectedly fierce. Russian forces also remain blocked 10 kilometers from the center of Chernihiv, northeast of Kiev, according to Pentagon estimates. The Russians appear to be focusing on the pro-Russian separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk in the east. The official also said the Pentagon believes Moscow is, at least to some degree, trying to fix Ukrainian forces in that area so that they cannot be used elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Red Cross is saying it hoped to lead an evacuation of thousands of civilians from Mariupol. However, they said they need concrete agreements on where fleeing residents would be escorted to. Take a look.
We have permission to move today, and we're en route towards Mariupol. And the hope is that we'll be able to then begin, once everything is in place, the parties have agreed on a destination, on a safe route and so forth, that we will begin evacuating today. That is as far as I can tell you at this point, because tomorrow is a new day and we'll have to see whether the operation can continue. So I can't say more than that at this time. I think we will have to take it day by day at this point. The details that we insist are cemented in place include the exact safe passage route, its exact start time, and its duration.
Now, Watson said 54 buses and many more civilian vehicles containing thousands of people seeking to flee the city were expected to take part in the convoy. Following the invasion of February 24, Russian forces have encircled and relentlessly bombarded Mariupol to try to recapture the strategic city, and much of the city has now been reduced to rubble, with tens of thousands of civilians still trapped inside with little food, water, or medicine. The organization had 2 trucks filled with food, medicine, and relief items, but they remained behind in Zaporizhia. Meanwhile, Moscow on Friday accused Kiev of carrying out its first airstrike on Russian soil, further dashing hopes of any de-escalation in President Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine. The spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said the Russian authorities were doing everything to reorganize the fuel supply chain to avoid disruption of energy supplies in Belgorod. Russian energy giant Rosneft, which owns the facility, said it had evacuated staff from the premises. Governor Gladkov said in a telegram message that emergency workers were trying to contain the fire as quickly as possible and that there was no threat to residents. Ukraine is yet to claim responsibility for this attack. If it were to confirm, it would be the first time that Ukrainian aircraft have flown into Russian airspace to hit a target, and this would bring the war home to Russia. And now a major announcement from President Biden, with gas prices soaring to the highest level since 2009. The president ordering the release of 180 million barrels of oil from the nation's emergency supply, a record 1 million barrels per day for 6 months.
Today, I'm authorizing the release of 1 million barrels per day for the next 6 months, over 180 million barrels. For the from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This is a wartime bridge to increase oil supply until production ramps up later this year. And it is by far the largest release of our national reserve in our history. It will provide a historic amount of supply for a historic amount of time. U.S. oil companies made nearly $80 billion in profit last year, and this year those profits are expected to continue to soar. This is the time, not the time to sit on record profits. It's time to step up for the good of your country, the good of the world, to invest in immediate production that we need to respond to Vladimir Putin, to provide some relief for your customers, not investors and executives.
In California, fallout from the war in Ukraine is most noticeable at the gas pumps. Reporting from California, here's Macy Membrere.
Thank you. In California and across the country, gas continues to be a hot topic because of the high prices. Although the national average for gas prices has started to level out and in some states decrease, California has seen an increase from the last week and remains the highest in the country. According to AAA, the current national average is about $4.29, with an average in California at $5.76. This is an increase of more than $1 in California when compared to last month's gas prices.
I would rather have high gas prices here than an authoritarian regime in the Ukraine. So if we have to suffer with a little bit of inflation in gas prices for a while to assure that such a wonderful country as Ukraine has an opportunity to develop its democracy, we should do that. Especially
with all that's going on in Ukraine and the Russian boycott and sanctions, it's a price to pay for doing the right thing.
In other news, California is sending supplies to aid Ukrainian refugees, which includes medical supplies such as IV kits, defibrillators, and beds. Now, Governor Newsom joined to help in sending out these packages, which also included 100 oxygen concentrators and personal protective equipment to refugee camps. Here's a short video posted by the Office of the Governor of California.
So many Ukrainians live in the state of California. We're accommodating their needs, their families' needs, everything you possibly can need, from beds to support medical supplies that are direct asks from the Ukrainian government.
In Sacramento, California, Macy Member Eagle News. We live in interesting times.
From California, we go to the UK. The price of Britain's traditional takeaway fish and chips is set to rise as a result of sanctions on Russian whitefish, as well as sharply rising energy prices. Our correspondent from the United Kingdom, Erica Celestino, reports from London.
They have weathered the storm of Brexit and COVID and are fighting the tide of rising inflation. But thousands of British fish and chip shops could be sunk by the war in Ukraine. At Captain's in the seaside resort of Brighton on England's south coast, owner Pam Sandhu is normally not one to complain. Yet the shelves of her large refrigerators are empty when they should be full of fresh white fish ready to be dipped in batter and deep fried, then served to hungry customers with piping hot chips.
Fish is just so expensive at the moment, and people can't find the sizes that we want. This is all post-pandemic. It's you buy it as a graded size, and I think people are struggling to source the ones that they need, what they usually use. So that's affecting things a little bit.
In ordinary times, Russia supplied between 30 and 40% of the fish sold in British fish and chip shops, mostly cod and haddock. Ukraine is the world's biggest exporter of vegetable oil, which is used for deep frying, what the NFF calls Britain's undisputed national dish.
What needs to happen is other countries like Norway, I think the UK as well, they produce a lot of whitefish. We need to start stepping up and filling in for the position which once was Russia's, and that will take some time. But we're trying to absorb these costs as much as possible. We don't want to pass it on to the consumers.
Sandhu's restaurant has a terrace that looks out onto Brighton's Pebble Beach and Pier. She bought it 3 years ago and had planned to open in March 2020. Then came COVID, followed by rising inflation, and now the war in Ukraine and sanctions against Russia. It's been the perfect storm for fish and chips vendors. On a sunny spring Friday in late March, Sandhu was worrying whether she would even have enough fish to get through the weekend.
Well, we've been in this industry for over 30 years. There's never, ever been a shortage on fish. We've never looked at any shortage on any products than what we're going through now.
Crook, a fish and chip shop owner in Lancashire, northwest England, has increased his prices by 50 pence, a portion to £8.50. Fish has become even more expensive because some British trawlers are staying in port due to the high cost of fuel.
The other thing that's happening as well, a lot of the domestic fleet aren't going out fishing because of the cost of fuel. It's just not worth them going out and setting sail, so that's further pressure on the supply of fish, and it's driving prices further north.
Fish and chips, first served as a single dish in the 1860s, has long been a working class staple, although demographic and dietary changes have seen its popularity wane in recent years. The takeaway favorite, covered in lashings of salt and vinegar, used to be wrapped in old newspaper and is typically served with mushy peas or tartar sauce.
You know, but we do have to keep supporting all their local businesses, and as long as I can afford it, I will come down and have fish and chips whenever I can, because it's part of my growing up. It's part of my culture.
Reporting from London, Erica Celestino, back to you, Alma.
Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine will cause negative economic spillovers around the world, with the poor taking the biggest hit. That was announced by the IMF today in a press briefing held in Washington, D.C. Jerry Rice, the head of the communications department at the IMF, exclaimed that the shock will likely be transmitted via worsening supply-demand imbalances and further increase in commodity prices. Let's listen in.
The poor are most likely to be affected, with a large share of expenditure, with a larger share of their expenditure on essential items like food and fuel. The concentration of effects in these categories mean that the cost of living squeeze, if you like, hurts the poor most. Agricultural communities will face conflicting effects of these shocks, higher prices for inputs, think about fuel, think about fertilizers, and outputs, agricultural commodities. And how these play out, the eventual balance depends on local conditions, but overall, it's going to be the low-income households and producers that will be hurt most. That's within countries. Across countries, higher prices for international food commodities impact countries differently, of course, depending on the food share of households' consumption baskets and the types of food consumed. Again, households in low-income countries are particularly exposed to changes, for example, in the price of staple cereals, with their diets often concentrated in just one type of grain. Low-income countries where wheat, corn, and sorghum are a large part of the diet have already seen inflation almost wholly driven by rising food prices. And some emerging market economies, including in the Middle East and Central Asia, have also been similarly affected by higher global food prices.
He also said supply chain disruptions over the war in Ukraine are most likely to affect low-income households with a larger share of their expenditure on essential items. Like what he said, food and fuel. Again, let's listen in.
Everyone is looking at the disruption in supply chains. The war-induced supply disruptions, notably for food and energy, will increase the cost of living, particularly for low-income households, and targeted fiscal support for those households can help cushion the impact. They will add, these war-induced supply disruptions will also add to pre-existing inflation pressures. And if signs emerge that inflation will be high over the medium term, and there is a tangible risk of inflation expectations de-anchoring, I say if, central banks may be forced to react even faster than currently anticipated by raising interest rates. So policymakers should, of course, continue to communicate clearly the outlook for inflation and monetary policies.
The news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be right back.
Tama na! Puro kayo daldal! Sa dami ng problema ng mga syudad, panahon na para magbigay ng lunas!
Kailangan ng lunas sa problema ng no work, no pay. Lunas sa sweldo, sa kita, sa benepisyo. Kailangan nila ay party list sa Kongreso.
Ihanda mo ang puwersa ng Lunas Party List!
Lunas Party List, number 58 sa balota.
Mr. Pwede! Masama at bawal ang pag-inom! Diyan ka na naman sa kakabawal mo, Mr. Bawal eh. Napaka-KJ mo. Walang magandang dulot ang pag-inom. Lalo na't eleksyon ngayon. Bawal yan!
Ayon sa Omnibus Election Code, ang pagbibenta, pagbili o pag-inom ng alak sa araw ng eleksyon ay isang election offense.
Inggit ka lang! Oye, oye! Pakawalan niyo ako! Hindi na ako uulit! Hay nako! nasa uli talaga ang pagsisisi. Don't drink and vote. Ako si Mr. Bawal na nagpapaalala na hindi na nga mabuti ang pag-inom ng alak, tapos sa eleksyon, gagawin mo pa? Bawal yan!
A public service message of Net25 for Mata ng Halalan 2022. Matatag, matapang, matapat.
We now go to pandemic news. Singapore fully reopened its borders to all vaccinated visitors after a 2-year coronavirus closure, with arrivals saying it felt wonderful to travel again without onerous restrictions. Let's listen in.
It looks that we are coming back to normality. So it's good.
It's a relief, actually. It's a really, that we don't have to worry about all the, there's so many things that you worry, you miss out, you see. But when you come this time, it's just so simple. Everything, you just need to read up and then get everything sorted out.
The aviation hub, a key gateway for people arriving in Asia, joins other countries in the region that have recently dropped travel curbs as they shift to living with COVID-19. Previously, only travelers from a handful of places could enter Singapore without quarantining, but from Friday, all vaccinated arrivals just need a negative COVID test. The city-state's Changi Airport buzzed with activity as passengers streamed out of the arrival area, while hundreds were lining up in the departure zone to make trips outside Singapore. And Malaysia, too, is now open to international tourists. Our correspondent from Malaysia, Alfred Balmes, reports from Kuala Lumpur. Hello, Alfred.
Hi, Alma. Good evening.
Good evening. Go ahead.
Malaysia fully reopens its border to all vaccinated visitors Friday after a 2-year COVID shutdown. As a UAE-based Etihad Airways flight bearing over 200 passengers in the first international flight to arrive at the country's main airport on the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur. Let's listen in into some reactions.
And during 2 years, impossible to come here, impossible. And suddenly, very good idea, open again. So I'm here for the first day and very happy to be here in Malaysia again.
Do you have any hopes now?
To my opinion, we are open in a new area where it will be more easy to travel without the constraints of this COVID. Because the virus seems to be less dangerous. So you see,
a lot for business. So for the past 2 years, it's been very hard to come back to Malaysia. So I've actually been waiting for the last week to come back from Abu Dhabi. So I'm very glad to come back this time without quarantine and without having to go through so many processes that I have in the last 2 years.
It's starting to feel, a little normal again, right? So there's still, still have to do some testing here and there, but the travel, everyone's learning how to deal with, the new phase of the virus, and that's been really nice, yeah.
European. The travelers a warm welcome from State Executive Councilor at both the CIQs in Johor. The Prime Minister, Datuk Seri Ismail Sabri Yaakob, had earlier said the decision to reopen the borders was made after careful deliberation on various aspects. That includes the national vaccination program and economy, with risk management conducted by the authorities. Previously, tourists were barred from entering Malaysia, but vaccinated travelers can now do so with only a negative COVID test. Bollingham, Group CEO of leading regional carrier AirAsia, which is based in Malaysia, predicted a surge in people flying. On the number of new COVID-19 cases, Dr. Nur Hisham said the country continued to record below 20,000 cases for 5 consecutive days, with 18,560 cases reported yesterday, bringing the cumulative number of new cases to 4,201,919. Back to you, Alma.
Thank you very much for that. Good news indeed, Alfred. Stay safe.
Likewise, live reporting from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, this is Alfred Balmes. We live in interesting times.
Thank you, Alfred. The news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be right back.
Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, parating na pag-asa, sabay nating matatanaw. Uklod, Philippines, number 78 sa balot. Mga bata, matanda, kahit saan man nagmula sa biyahe ng pag-unlad natin ay makakasama ka. Uklod, Filipino, number 78 sa balota.
Welcome back. Fresh sanctions on North Korea after its recent test firing of an intercontinental ballistic missile. Our correspondent from Japan, Dennis Liu, reports from Tokyo. Dennis.
Japan's government approved fresh sanctions against North Korea over its recent test firing of an intercontinental ballistic missile, following Washington's calls for tougher international punishment for the nuclear-armed state. Japan already has bans on trade and vessel entries as part of unilateral sanctions against Pyongyang, but said Friday it would designate 4 groups and 9 individuals involved in nuclear and missile development. Top government spokesman Hirokazu Matsuno told the entities and individuals would be subject to an asset freeze. North Korea said the launch was a successful test of a Hwasong-17 missile, a long-range ICBM that analysts say may be capable of carrying multiple warheads, which it first unveiled at a military parade in 2020. But South Korea's defense ministry said that Seoul and Washington have now concluded that the launch was actually of a Hwasong-15, an ICBM that Pyongyang test-fired in 2017. Japanese officials say, nonetheless, danger remains the same. They say the latest launch shows that North Korea now could have the United States mainland in its range if the weapon was fired on a normal trajectory. It also alarmed Japan, particularly as the missile landed inside its exclusive economic zone. This is the latest for now. Reporting from Tokyo, Japan, this is Dennis Liu. We live in interesting times.
Thank you, Dennis. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka was under heavy security today after hundreds of protesters tried to storm the president's home in a night of violence and anger at the unprecedented economic crisis. Thursday night's unrest outside Gotabaya Rajapaksa's private home in the capital saw hundreds of men and women rallied by unidentified social media activists demanding he step down. And as police fired tear gas and water cannon, the crowd turned violent. They set ablaze 2 military buses, a police jeep, 2 patrol motorcycles, and a 3-wheeler. They also threw bricks at officers. Police said 53 protesters were arrested, but local media organizations said 5 new photographers were also detained and tortured at a local police station. The charge, the government said it will investigate. Sri Lanka is facing its worst economic crisis in living memory, and the state electricity monopoly said it also enforced the 13-hour power cuts from Thursday, the longest ever, because it did not have diesel for generators. Several state-run hospitals have stopped conducting surgeries as they have run out of essential life-saving medicines. Sri Lanka's predicament has been compounded by the pandemic, which torpedoed tourism and remittances. And many economists also say the crisis has been exacerbated by government mismanagement and years of accumulated borrowing. Now, have you heard of arboviruses? They are some of the world's most dangerous mosquito-borne illnesses, such as dengue, yellow fever, chikungunya, and Zika. Now, they're all mosquito-borne illnesses too, and they represent massive health threats in tropical and subtropical parts of the planet, where more than half of the world's people live. Faced with a growing number of arboreal or arboviral outbreaks worldwide, the UN Health Agency launched a global initiative to prevent a new pandemic. Here's Dr. Mike Ryan, WHO's head of the World Health Organization. Take a look.
Each of these diseases, there have been gains in different aspects of surveillance, response, research and development. But sustainability is often limited to the scope and duration of disease-specific projects. There is an urgent need to re-evaluate the tools at hand and how these can be used across diseases to ensure efficient response, evidence-based practice, equipped and trained personnel and engagement of communities.
Now, Dr. Ryan noted that interest in the WHO initiative has been strong in the 2-year run-up to Thursday's launch, despite the pressures of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, as there are concerns about arboviral disease spread in populations that are least equipped to deal with them. And that's all we have for you today. As always, I'll end the day on a thoughtful note. Our ability to look back and smile at our past is proof that God's plan is to keep us moving forward. This has been Eagle News International. I'm Alma Angela. Stay alert, stay informed, because we live in interesting times. Good night.